Welcome to part 2 of the potting mix component video. As a quick recap, we'll be running through 13 different components, their beneficial properties, some less desirable properties, and how to use them in your potting mixes to help your plants thrive. So this is part 2. We'll be running through most of the front row as well as those that weren't on the tray. So lots of hopefully useful content coming up. Now if you didn't watch the part 1 of the series, I'll link that in the description below if you'd like to watch that first, then come back to this, but there's no harm in watching that retrospectively, so I'll also link it at the end if you do want to watch that too, to get the details of all 13 components. Now, I did start the first video with a bit of a game to see how many of these 13 you already knew or could maybe guess, and then run through the videos to see which ones you got correct. So if you did want to take part in that, then start with video 1 and come back to this. This video is also linked at the end of video 1, so it's really easy to come back to afterwards. So now let's get on with the other components, see which ones you got correct, and again, as with the other video, please do share in the comments below if you know of any other uses for the components that I covered today that I don't actually talk about in this video, as well as any others beyond the 13 that I'm covering. Let me know in the comments below, as I'd love to see them, but you'd also be helping out other viewers too. Now this next one is number 7, and this one is one of my favourites. I wasn't aware of this before buying these and researching for the video. So this is lava rock, and this is almost what I would imagine if you were to go to Mars and take rocks off Mars. This is what I think it would look like. So I'm not sure if the camera picked up the colour, but it's got a lovely sort of reddish brown colour, and it's very heavy. Compared to all of the other components that I've shown so far, this one is definitely the heaviest, and this is quite coarse as well, so these are chunkier pieces in here. You can get this as a finer grade and a medium grade as well if you want smaller pieces, just like with some of the other components that I mentioned earlier, like the charcoal for example. So this one is good in a similar way to the clay that we mentioned just a moment ago. Lots of similar properties. It is, even though it's so heavy, it is a porous rock. So just like the clay and the charcoal for example, it can soak up moisture, soak up nutrients, release them slowly back into the potting mix, and it can obviously help with that drainage because it will create lots of sort of segments where these break up the soil, help with aeration and help with water to drain through. Just like with clay, use it as a bottom layer, as a drainage layer. You could, I definitely will be doing this going forwards, use it as a decorative layer just to get those wonderful red rocks on top as a decorative element, but also again just to help protect the soil, keep the moisture in, and to help with avoiding any fungus gnats get into the soil. One thing that I did find when I was researching this is this can be used in a similar function to the bark as well. So where you might use the bark for epiphytic plants that like to attach to things in the soil for support, then you can use this as well. So if you didn't want the bark, if the bark was too light and you wanted something a bit heavier, or you just wanted to use something that will last longer, so the bark will break down a lot quicker than lava rock will, so you could use this for something a little bit more long lasting, and it will have the same function and help support those plant roots too. Now on to number 8, and this one's going to be quite brief because I feel like I'm repeating myself a little bit. Like I said before, lots of these components have similar beneficial properties. Now this one is a byproduct of lava rock, and we're starting to go a little bit lighter, so we're going to go on a bit of a journey with these next components. So this is a byproduct of lava rock. This one has a little bit of weight to it, but it is quite a bit lighter than lava rock, and this is pumice. So you might be familiar with this where you use it in the bathroom to get rid of dead skin and that sort of stuff, but this is obviously broken down into a medium grade. Again, you can get this in different grades, coarse grade and finer grade. So it's just like gravel really, and it's lots of little pieces of porous pumice there, so it can be used just like some of those other components that I mentioned a moment ago for moisture retention and nutrient retention for that slow release, to help with drainage where it'll obviously break up the soil and help the water run through. Use it as a drainage layer at the bottom, use it on top, it's quite decorative, again just like the clay, just like the lava rock. And what I forgot to mention with the clay and these, and I'll touch on again with another component later, you can use these for propagations as well. So just like you might use something like leca, which I'll touch on a bit later, you can start propagations in these where you can obviously water it, it'll take up that water, it'll keep a moist environment, but you've got lots of airflow in there as well to obviously help avoid any nastiness or any rot of those cuttings before they start to develop roots. So lots of different uses for this. This is a good sort of middle product, if you're after something that has a bit of weight to it, but not as heavy as lava rock and not as light as perlite, this is a really good sort of in-between to add to your potting mixes. So now we're at the end of the journey from the lava rock to the pumice and now to the perlite. So this is number 9, and this is expanded lava rock, and you'll have seen the colour change from that dark red to the pumice, the grey, and now this really distinctive white. So I'm sure many of you will have got this right in the quiz at the start, because this is a really popular component, and for good reason. It's readily available, it's relatively affordable, and it's great for so many different uses. You can use this as pretty much a catch-all. If you need grit for drainage purposes, this is your go-to. If you didn't want to use any of the other components that I mentioned just a moment ago, I'm pointing down there because they're down there on a table, but this is your go-to component. The maybe upside or downside, depending on what you're using it in the mix for, is it's incredibly lightweight, and it's almost a bit like polystyrene. If you've ever used it, you'll know what I mean. If you've not used it, it's incredibly light, almost to the point, like if you imagine polystyrene, when you break it up, the little balls, they go everywhere, they'll blow in any type of breeze and they get stuck to static surfaces. That's very much like what this is like, even though it is a grit. So it's got that porosity to it, and it's quite hard wearing despite being very light. So mix it into your potting mixes for that added drainage. Because it's porous, it has those moisture retentive and nutrient retentive properties that we mentioned with some of the others, so it can release those slowly over time. You can actually activate it by, again, like the charcoal, putting it in some diluted fertiliser, then putting it in your mix, and that will provide a slow release fertiliser into your potting mix over time. And if you are using it in a mix, you might be using it for things like plants with finer or more delicate root systems. Because it is so light, it's not going to cause an obstruction in the potting mix, whereas some of these harder, heavier mixes might do. For example, if you put lava rock in something that has really delicate roots, it might not like that in the potting mix, whereas this will probably move out of the way depending on how compact the mix is. And actually that's one downside that you will find, depending on how loose the mixture of your potting mix is. As you water over time, you might actually find, because this is so light, it gradually works its way to the top, and you'll find more perlite on top of the mix as opposed to actually mixed in. So you might need to bear that in mind and mix it in over time without making your mix too compact around the plant. So lots of really beneficial uses for this, and I'm going to move on to the next component, and sometimes there's a bit of a debate on whether to use perlite or the next component, so hopefully I can clear that up if you are unsure about that next. Now on to the 10th one. This you may have recognised as vermiculite with its wonderful gold shiny surface. So this almost looks like fool's gold, but it's a lot lighter than a rock. It's actually a mineral, so its technical name or term is magnesium aluminium iron sulfate, but vermiculite is a lot easier to say. Now this often gets confused with perlite as to when to use which component, because this is readily available in just the same way, and it's been used in horticulture for years. So it does still have some of those beneficial properties of aiding drainage, because it is quite chunky, so you put that in a potting mix and it will help break up the structure or texture so water can drain through quite easily. But this can actually hold up to 3 to 4 times its weight in water. So if you have plants that need a lot of moisture, don't like to dry out at all, mix some of this into the potting mix and it'll help to soak up excess moisture so plants aren't sitting in water, but then release this slowly. And this is perhaps more effective than a lot of the other components that I've mentioned. Even though they can have that slow release moisture function, this obviously has a much higher capability of doing that. Now it can be used for a number of different things as well, so if not in the mix, use it as a drainage layer at the bottom of the pot if you just put your plant straight into a decorative pot, or maybe if you use that as an additional protection for your plant, even if they are in plastic pots that then go into decorative pots. You can use it as a top layer too to help maintain moisture in the soil, but also because it's got that wonderful shiny surface, it's almost a decorative element too, and just like I said with some of the others, could prevent pests from getting into the soil depending on how thick a layer you use. You can use it on its own as well, so you could use it for starting seedlings as well as propagations, just like you could with some of the grittier elements that I mentioned earlier. So because it has that moisture retention property, as well as being quite loose in structure, so it's still got some aeration around it, really good for starting roots on seedlings or propagations before you then pot them on. So a really great component to use for many different things, just like you can with perlite. Now, the difference between the two, I think the easiest way to distinguish them is if you want something that's really well draining, that doesn't hold on to too much moisture, use perlite. So plants that don't like to sit in wet soil and like to dry out quite quickly, or maybe not dry out, but at least not sit in water and get the water through the pot quite quickly, use perlite. If you want moisture retention, balanced moisture, and plants that aren't going to dry out, at least not for a period of time, then use vermiculite, which will help to maintain that moisture in the soil. Now on to number 11, and I don't actually have any of this, although I tried to get it for the video and I wanted to try some myself in my potting mixes. So this one is worm castings. You may have recognised it if you've used it yourself before, or you may have just thought it was charcoal again, because it does look very similar with those little black particles. So this is actually the waste of worms. So just like we use things like cattle manure or chicken manure in our gardens for its nutrient properties, and because it's organic material, it breaks down and improves the quality of the soil. This can be used in exactly the same way. So worm castings will provide organic material for your potting mixes, as well as give them a nutrient boost, so helping your plants to thrive, and they'll break down slowly over time. Now you can use this in another way, where you can soak it in water to effectively make a natural fertiliser, and then use that water to water your plants and fertilise your plants with. So there are a couple of different ways that you can use it there, as well as a top dressing. So even if you've not mixed it into your soil or potting mix, you can put it on top, and over time with the waterings you'll gradually be releasing those nutrients down into the potting mix to help your plant thrive, as well as over time it will just break down naturally and improve the fertility and conditions of that potting mix for your plant. Now onto the 12th one. I don't actually have this one, but I'm sure you will have recognised it from the photo. So this is Leca lightweight expanded clay aggregate, and this one is something that's been quite popular over the last couple of years, at least during the plant craze. You will have seen it a lot on social media, and this has been around for, I'm sure, a lot longer, and it's used for a lot more than just supporting our plants. But in our plant mixes, we would use it for very similar reasons that we might use many of the other rocks and clay components that I've already spoken about. So because it is porous, you've got that ability to soak up water, soak up nutrients, and then slowly release those into the potting mix and help our plants slowly over time. It will help with breaking up the structure, helping to give a more aerated and looser texture to our potting mixes. So it may be also suitable for plants with chunkier root systems too, because they will obviously have be those larger components in the potting mix. Just like you can use the other rocks and clay components, you could use it as an extra drainage layer at the bottom of the pot, or if you thought they were decorative, use them as a top layer as well, just like we said with many of the others. Now I'm sure it's not a new practice, but one of the things that you might have seen over the last few years is people moving from a traditional potting mix to using just Leca. And this is really interesting to see, where you can see all of the little pellets of clay with the plant roots visibly on display, at least if you're using a clear container, and it can help to maintain moisture levels while protecting the plant from too much water or too much moisture. It can increase the aeration and almost cleanliness around the roots as well, as opposed to them being in different potting mixes and components. Now there are some downsides as well. It's not suitable for all plants, so you can Google it and find out resources that will tell you what plants it works with and what it doesn't. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I don't know enough about it to do so, because I don't practice it myself. But if you do, please do share in the comments below, or if you've got any links to further resources that are really useful that other viewers might want to see, share them in the comments below, because it would be interesting for further reading. Now just on that note, you can also use Leca in a similar way for propagations, just like you can with vermiculite and sphagnum moss. So if you've got any propagations, use Leca for that as well, if you didn't want to put them in water or soil. So lots of uses for that, and worth doing a little bit more exploring to learn more about it. And here's lucky number 13. So this one is a little bit different from the photo that I've shown, although I'm sure you would have got it correct as it's a very popular component. This is a dehydrated block of coconut core. The photo showed it broken down, or made up should I say, in its usable capacity. So this gives a little bit of a clue as to its beneficial property. So this is how it's usually shipped, because it makes it a lot easier to obviously buy it and ship it in this manner, as it's got all of the water taken out and it's just squashed together. But the great thing about this is when you add water to it, it soaks up all that moisture and then it expands to its true size. And this makes it a really good component for moisture retention. So you can add it into mixes just like you would with vermiculite, where you want that extra moisture retention to keep that balanced moisture in the potting mix. You can use it on its own as well, so this is probably the main direct substitute for soil or compost. If you didn't want to use soil or compost, this seems to be the go-to substitute, and then you can use this either on its own or by using this as the base and then mixing in other components depending on what you're after. The downsides of using this are it can, just like with the soil, using the soil on its own, it can, if it dries out, become quite compacted and almost hydrophobic, where the water doesn't want to go into it anymore, especially over time. It can harden off, and also it's usually not got any nutrients in it. You can buy some that have nutrients that have been added to it as part of the manufacturing process, just like you can get bags of soil with the slow release fertilizer pellets in it, but usually it doesn't have any nutrients. So what you would need to do if you do decide to use this on its own or as a base is add things in that can give those nutrients. So either fertilise regularly or use maybe bark or worm castings, for example, to give that mix some of those nutrients that your plants will need. So that's 13 different components that we've covered. Did you know all of them, or were any new to you? Would you consider any for future potting mixes, or maybe even avoid some going forwards now you know a bit more about them? Also, thinking of the quiz, how many of those did you get correct? Let me know in the comments below, because I'd love to know if we got anyone with 13 out of 13 and if we've got any potting mix experts in our viewership. If you have found this video interesting, consider subscribing, as I have new videos every week, usually on plant related topics, anything that falls under that umbrella. And if you haven't watched the first part of the series, then again that is linked at the end if you do want to watch that retrospectively for the rest of the components. If you've got any questions, put them in the comments below and I'll respond to everyone, and as always, thank you for watching Grow Your Wellbeing.